Welcome back to Human Biology with Dr. B. Today we're talking about the cardiovascular system. The last two lectures we've covered the blood and the blood vessels, and today we are talking about the heart. Well, first, what is it? Now, if it's February, we usually think of this. A big red bubbly heart. Oh, doesn't everybody love it? And fun fact, the heart actually kind of resembles the shape. But what we're talking today is this, a muscular organ that sits in your thoracic cavity that's about the size of your fist. If it's larger than your fist, typically that denotes some type of cardiovascular insufficiency, if you will, or disease. It's about the size of your fist, and if you were to clench your fist and put it directly angled towards the left side of your body, that is exactly where your heart is. So the top of the heart is angled toward the left side, and the apex, the bottom part, is angled toward the right. It sits mostly in the left side of your cavity, which is why when we say the Pledge of Allegiance and cover our heart, our right hand goes over the left side. There it is. So what does it do? It pumps blood. We think of it as a pump, but as I mentioned in the blood vessel lecture, it's more of a push and pull. As the myocardium, the cardiac muscle tissue contracts, it actually contracts more with a squeezing or a wringing out. Think of wringing out a dish rag than more of a straight 1, 2, 3 pumping as we typically think of it. So when it wrings out the heart muscle and wrings out the blood in it, it's a push. It increases the pressure on the heart until it overcomes the pressure of the valves and the blood moves out into either the pulmonary artery or the aorta, as you can see here, either the aorta or the pulmonary artery. Out to the pulmonary artery goes to the lungs, the aorta goes to the body. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But it's also a pull. As the blood is being pushed out, it creates a type of vacuum, which will allow the pulling of the blood back into the right side of the heart and then back into from the left atrium, or pull it from the lungs into the left atrium, into the ventricle, and then again, it is a cycle. So let's talk about the structure. There are 3 layers of the heart. The first one is the endocardium, which is down here. It covers the inner surface of the heart. The most inner layer is called the endothelium, and as we talked about with the blood vessels, the endothelium, the most inner lining of the endocardium, is continuous with the endothelium that runs all the way through the blood vessels and will eventually become the capillary. It's really cool. It's all one enclosed system. This is a thin lining of the cavities of the heart, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. It reduces resistance to the blood flow, so it basically is the lube that makes sure the blood flows through the heart well. And then we have the myocardium, which is right here. The myocardium is the largest part of the heart. This is the actual muscular structure. This is the thick wall of the heart, and it is cardiac muscle tissue, same as skeletal muscle tissue, is striated. It does operate on the sliding filament theory. However, it's connected via intercalated discs, as you can see right here. You can see the intercalated discs that allow for a much stronger, more of that twisting motion contraction, because the heart is more of a circular structure. And then we have the pericardium. The pericardium is the most external layer of the heart. And if you've ever done any type of running or any type of lifting or hard labor with your hands, you realize that any type of continuous motion will create a blister. Now, the way that I describe the pericardium to my students is that this is the heart's blister prevention. Between the 2 layers of the pericardium, we have the parietal and the visceral, we have this very thick viscous substance that basically, because the heart is contracting, it's a muscle, it's contracting over and over and over and over again. And if any type of friction occurs in this contraction, it can actually cause a blister, which, can you imagine having a blister on your heart? That would probably be the most painful thing ever. And you thought your last breakup was painful. Just kidding. So we have the parietal and the visceral pericardium and a viscous substance inside to prevent any type of friction during the heartbeat. Which brings us to the structures of the heart. we have the chambers. The septum is right here. It is between the left ventricle and the right ventricle, and it separates the two halves of the heart. Each half of the heart has two chambers. We have the atria, as you can see at the top. We have a right atria and a left atria, and we have ventricles. The ventricles are the much larger chambers, if you will, because they have this much larger muscular structure. As you can see here, the left ventricle has a much thicker ventricular wall than the right ventricle does. And that's because the right ventricle only has to pump out through the pulmonary aorta to the lungs on either side of the heart, whereas the left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood through all the way to the tippy top of your head and the very bottom of your toes. It creates that amount of pressure to create this push and the pull on the blood to continue it circulating through all of your tissues. And then we have the valves. Now we have two different types of valves. We have the atrioventricular valves, which, as you may have guessed, are between the atria and the ventricles. And then we have the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are right here. They prevent backflow once the ventricles have contracted and pushed the blood into the pulmonary artery and the aorta. These semilunar valves will close very quickly to prevent the backflow of the blood into the ventricles. So the blood flow to the heart. So when we move blood to the heart, it is coming from the body. We call this the pulmonary circuit. So initially, this is in the right side of the heart. It is, you can see it right here. We call it oxygen poor blood. But as we know, the blood at any point, if you're still breathing and your heart is still beating, still has about 75% of the obtained oxygen, which is why you can hold your breath for at least 2 minutes. But please don't, because you might pass out. This contains blood lower in oxygen, and it pumps blood through the pulmonary circuit. So blood coming from the body is received here from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. It comes right here to the right atria and then is pumped down to the right ventricle and out through the pulmonary artery, which goes over to the right lung and the left lung. There it is. That's the right side. And the flow of blood through the pulmonary circuit is from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve, the right ventricle, the pulmonary semilunar valve, the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary arteries, lungs, pulmonary veins, and then to the left atrium. Then we get to the systemic circuit. This is the left side of the heart. This contains blood that has more oxygen than in the right side. This pumps blood through the systemic circuit, and the systemic circuit services basically everything else in your body except for your lungs. Every single other thing. It's pretty amazing. Goes from the left atria to the AV valve, the bicuspid or the mitral valve. The left ventricle, the aortic semilunar valve, the aorta, the body tissues, the inferior vena cava, and then back to the right atrium. And that is how the blood flows from the body to the right side of the heart, out to the lungs, back to the left side of the heart, out to the body, and then back to the right side. It's a wonderful, beautiful circuit. Which brings us to the cardiac cycle. Now, the cardiac cycle has three main events. We have the atria contracting, we have the ventricles contracting, and then we have relaxation. And if you've ever listened to your heartbeat, you know that that relaxation does not take very long, which we're all very thankful for. So the first thing, this is in opposite order, but this is where I like starting. We have the atria systole. Systole means contraction. So both atria contract at the same time with, it's called isoventricular contraction. So, isovolumetric contraction. They contract with the same volume pushing into the ventricle. Then we move to ventricular systole, where the atria have contracted, pushed the blood into the ventricles. Now it's the time for the ventricles to contract. Both the right and the left ventricles contract at the same time, and they force blood either to the pulmonary circuit or to the systemic circuit. From there, we go to early diastole, where right after ventricular systole occurs, it creates a sort of vacuum, as we've talked about. It says early diastole, where the atria and the ventricles are relaxed and passive filling occurs. Then lastly, we have later diastole, where the ventricles are actively relaxing and filling maximally. And then we move right back to atrial systole, because No one wants a heart to stop beating. So how does the heart know to beat? It has what we call a pacemaker, and we call this the sinoatrial node. It is right here. It's located in the right atrium, and this generates an electrical signal that sets the tempo of the heartbeat. Now, cardiac cells, they're called myocardiocytes. They have this intrinsic ability to contract independently both inside and outside of the body. So, for some reason, if you were a mad scientist and you wanted to plate cardiac cells, and you were to give them just a little bit of calcium, they would start beating. Now, if you had one cell beating, or as we call in muscles, we call it a twitch. So you have one cell twitching and you were to add another twitching cell next to it, they would uniformly come together and eventually start twitching on the same beat. It is pretty amazing, these cells. However, when we get to the large amount that we have in the heart, we need an outside control for these. And the outside control is this, the sinoatrial node. This is what is responsible for setting the tempo of the heartbeat. From the SA node, the electrical impulse moves to the AV node, which is located right here in the very upper part of the septum. Now, the electrical conductivity, as you can see here, spreads from the SA node directly across so that the atria contract at the same time, and then here to the AV node, right at the bottom, which is right here. And then it's located between the two atria, and this receives a signal. From here, it moves to the atrioventricular bundle, which moves down the septum, and then to the Purkinje fibers and out around the ventricles. And once it moves down the AV bundle and then out to the Purkinje fibers, this is what causes the contraction of the ventricles. So here we go. The first thing, the SA node activity and atrial activation begins. Ta-da! We have electrical activity at the SA node. This flows through both atria and initiates the contraction. As you can see here, atrial contraction begins. From here, the signal moves to the AV bundle, which you can see moves right through here. It's at the bottom of the right atria and moves directly into the septum. From here, it moves into the bundle branches, or the AV bundle. Right here is a new portion that we haven't talked about before. This is the moderator band. It's only in the right side of the heart, and it basically prevents overfilling and overstretching of the heart. So the signal moves from AV, or the SA, to the AV, down to the AV bundle, out to the Purkinje fibers. Once it moves out to the Purkinje fibers, the ventricles contract.
As mammals, humans have a four-chambered heart and two essentially separate circulatory loops. One is the pulmonary circulation, in which blood flows between the heart and the lungs. The other is the systemic circulation, in which blood circulates between the heart and the rest of the body. Blood that is loaded with oxygen is carried from the lungs to the left atrium, then to the left ventricle to be dispersed to the tissues of the body. Blood depleted of its oxygen is returned to the heart through the vena cava, and then to the right atrium and ventricle, where it's sent back to the lungs to be oxygenated again. The exchange of materials between the blood and tissues occurs in the smallest blood vessels of the body, the capillaries. In the pulmonary capillary bed, the deoxygenated blood cell loads oxygen and unloads carbon dioxide. In the systemic capillary bed, oxygen is delivered to the tissues, and carbon dioxide waste from the tissues enters the bloodstream. The vertebrate heart is a muscular pump that provides the force needed to circulate the blood. The human heart has four chambers, two atria, singular atrium, and two ventricles. The atria are thin-walled chambers of muscle that receive blood returning from the lungs and body, and the ventricles are thick-walled muscular chambers that generate the force to pump blood to the lungs and the rest of the tissues of the body. The right atrium receives oxygen-depleted blood through two veins called the inferior and superior venae cavae, singular vena cava. When the atria contract, blood in the right atrium is forced into the right ventricle. The right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium and, on contraction, sends this deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs through two veins called the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins are the only veins that carry oxygenated blood. When the atria contract, blood in the left atrium is forced into the left ventricle. The left ventricle has the thickest walls of the four chambers. It receives the oxygenated blood from the left atrium and, on contraction, sends it through the aorta to all the tissues of the body. The blood is prevented from flowing backward into the chambers by a system of flap-like valves. The four chambers of the heart alternate between contraction and relaxation in a concerted fashion. This pattern is called the cardiac cycle. A cardiac cycle consists of one complete diastole, the relaxation or expansion phase, and one complete systole or contraction phase. At the start of diastole, the heart muscle is relaxed and blood flows into the atria. Toward the end of diastole, both atria contract simultaneously, followed about 1/10 of a second later by the ventricular contraction. Atrial contraction at the end of diastole helps to fill the ventricles with blood immediately prior to the systole, the phase of the cardiac cycle during which both ventricles contract simultaneously. Step by step, the cycle works like this. Diastole begins when the atria relax and blood flows into the heart. Veins that carry deoxygenated blood from the body fill the right atrium. The left atrium is filled by the pulmonary veins, which carry oxygenated blood from the lungs. The atria are now filled with blood, while the ventricles are still relaxed. Some blood flows passively from the atria to the ventricles at this time. The atria contract, forcing blood into the relaxed ventricles. After contraction, the atrial valves prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atria. Next, the atria relax and the ventricles contract. Deoxygenated blood is pumped out of the right ventricle into the pulmonary arteries and carried to the lungs, while oxygenated blood is pumped out of the left ventricle through the aorta to the rest of the body. Upon relaxation, the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves prevent the backflow of blood from the exiting blood vessels to the ventricles. One cardiac cycle is completed in less than 1 second. Blood pressure varies according to the cardiac cycle. The diastolic blood pressure is the lowest pressure, occurring during ventricular relaxation. The systolic blood pressure is the peak pressure, which occurs during ventricular contraction. A stethoscope and sphygmomanometer are routinely used to measure diastolic and systolic pressure. The different sounds heard through the stethoscope, called Korotkov sounds, correspond to the contraction and relaxation of the heart. The cuff is first inflated so that it compresses the brachial artery. The pressure in the cuff is slowly released, and as it descends, it reaches a point where blood is able to spurt through the constricted artery only at the moments of highest blood pressure. This pressure, at which tapping sounds are first heard, is the systolic pressure, the blood pressure when the heart is contracting. As the pressure in the cuff continues to drop, a point is reached where the sounds disappear. The blood is now flowing continuously through the brachial artery. The pressure in the cuff when the sounds first disappear is the diastolic pressure, the blood pressure when the heart is relaxing. Blood pressure is reported in fractional notation, with systolic pressure as the numerator and diastolic pressure as the denominator. For example, a normal blood pressure might be 120/80 millimeters of mercury.
Which transitions us very nicely to discussing the blood pressure. Now, the blood pressure, as mentioned in the video, is the force exerted by the blood on the walls of the blood vessels. And as you can see from the picture and the video, it's taken using a stethoscope and say that 10 times fast. Go ahead, go for it. Sphygmomanometer. And if you've ever been to the doctor recently, most of this is all modernized and just basic technology does it. A machine does it for you. In my son's pediatric office, they still have the sphygmomanometer, the pressure reader on the wall. And I was talking to the doctor the other day, why do you have that up? Everything is mechanized. And he goes, oh, that's our ADD detector. If they can't leave it alone, then we have some suspicions. So there you go. Sphygmomanometers can be used for 2 different things. ADD and blood pressure, but not really ADD, just kidding. So, what happens if you've never had your blood pressure taken manually? Put the blood pressure cuff on, and the stethoscope is placed just underneath on the brachial artery, right as my son calls it, the elbow pit. Yes. And as the pressure is turned up on the blood pressure cuff, this tells you that you're increasing the pressure on the brachial artery, and you will hear two different sounds. This is significant of both the diastolic and systolic pressure. So the systolic pressure is the highest pressure exerted or that the artery will experience during ventricular systole. Ventricular systole is when the ventricles are actually physically contracting. Now, one of the things I want to make very clear is that when the heart pumps blood, it's not like a one shot through. So it's a continuous, because at no point is there no blood in your arteries. I don't know why I feel the need to clarify this, because when I first thought about this, I don't know, years and years ago, I thought literally that the heart would pump and the blood would go from your heart all the way to the toes. But it's more of a very slow inchworm moving its way through the arteries. And with every pump of the heart, the blood is pumped a little bit further and a little bit further until it actually does get all the way to your toes or all the way to the tippy top of your head. And this is caused by systole, ventricular contraction. The blood is continually pushed inch by inch all the way through your body. Now, when the ventricles contract, they exert about 110 to 120 millimeters of mercury. And you're like, thanks, millimeters of mercury. I don't even know what that is. Are we talking about the planet? Are we talking about the element? I don't even know. Millimeters of mercury is one of the measurements that we use in science for pressure. That's it. That's all. The end. Now, in adults, you've probably heard 120 over 80. And I remember that because the systolic is in the sky. Systolic, sky, start with the same letter. That's it. The end. That's how I remember it. Also, systole is contraction. So, the first sound we hear, so once the blood pressure cuff is pushed up, and you release the pressure, you'll start hearing what sounds like a heartbeat. And then as you continually release it, release the pressure, release the pressure, release the pressure, all of a sudden the sound goes away. And when the beating goes away, we call that the diastolic pressure. This is the lowest pressure that the artery will experience during any part of the cardiac cycle. So remember, arteries are and arterioles are the resistance vessels. So they have a much larger tunica media with smooth muscle in it. And this smooth muscle resists the pressure exerted by the heart on the blood. And this is so that the blood can get all the way through the body. So the diastolic pressure needs to actually be some type of pressure so that the blood can actually be pushed all the way through the body. Typical for an adult is about 70 to 80 millimeters of mercury. So normal would be 120 over 80 or 110 over 70. If you're an experienced athlete and extremely physically fit, this is much lower because your heart is much more effective with each contraction. Now, blood pressure can be influenced by sex. If you are a male or female, not that kind of sex, if you are male or female, gender, age, how old you are. Typically, it varies with how young you are or old you are. It can vary with the time of day. It can vary with how physically active you are. For example, if you're going to do a HIIT class, your blood pressure is going to increase very rapidly as your heart contracts much faster and much harder with each contraction. It can increase with stress. If you are in a stressful situation, your blood pressure will increase. This is a natural, it might not feel natural, but it's a natural consequence of the sympathetic nervous system kicking in. And also your lifestyle. Do you eat healthy? Do you participate in active activities every day? Do you get out and walk? Do you get out and move every day? Or do you just sit like a bump on a pickle? These things affect blood pressure. Now, at the end of this lecture, you should be able to do these things. Number 1, describe the structure of the heart and relate to the function of each structure. If you don't remember these, refer to the first part of the lecture. You should be able to diagram the flow of the blood from the heart through the tissues and then back to the heart. This is the second part of the lecture. Explain the cardiac cycle. Trace the electrical impulse through the heart. and relate the blood pressure to the cardiac cycle. This has been Dr. B. Thanks so much. I look forward to seeing you in class.